Welcome to The Other Coast, a podcast about the Malifaux meta in Los Angeles. My name is Jeff, and with me here today is another player in the SoCal area, Colgan.
Hey guys.
Hey Colgan. So today we're going to talk about playing from behind. It's a topic near and dear to my heart because it's a situation I often find myself in. And, I think unless you are some kind of savant, if you pick up Malifaux, you will also find yourself in this situation. So while this may be an episode of particular relevance to beginning players who may have a rough go at the start, it, I think, has relevance to pretty much anyone. So I think the first way to frame this discussion might be to talk about situations where the board state is known to both players. So both players are able to accurately judge who's ahead and who's behind. And so if you find yourself behind in that situation, what should you do? And maybe the first kind of subtopic is what to do when you're losing the board state through combat, right? Like the opponent has managed to gain an upper hand in the fighting, and maybe you've lost some models, or maybe your models are just not in good shape. But for whatever reason, in whatever manner, the fighting has not gone your way. So Colgan, in that situation, what are some things that you might look to do to kind of fight your way back into it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to keep in mind is this idea of sunk cost. So there's kind of a tendency for a lot of people, like after they've committed a certain amount of money or a certain amount of effort towards something, even when it stops being worth it, because they've already invested so much into it, they feel like they need to keep pushing in order to achieve that end.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's definitely times in Malifaux where you go into combat, you think you should have the advantage, but, you flip the black joker or they flip the red joker, and all of a sudden you're down a model and nowhere near accomplishing what you tried to do.
Right.
So at that point, if your plan failed, then you need to be able to reassess the situation and understand that maybe this combat is lost and you no longer actually have any good options for removing the enemy model and scoring or achieving whatever goal you originally set out to do. And you need to start looking at alternate ways to score, or how you can start denying your opponent or just tying up their models to try and keep the score as close as possible.
Okay, so Colgan, suppose I go into the middle thinking I'm going to win this fight, and for whatever reason, either because I misjudged or I got unlucky or my opponent reacted very effectively, I've lost this fight. Now, one kind of, mentality that comes back is sort of this clawback mentality, right? That if I get my activation, or if I flip the right trigger and get sort of this unlucky or unlikely result, it can turn the whole thing around and make it worth it. Is this throwing good money after bad, or is this something we're trying? How would you kind of evaluate that situation?
Right, so it really depends on the board state and what else is going on.
Take a drink, everyone.
With any action you take, me and Jim are always talking about like the resources you're dedicating and the likelihood of an action going off. If you know you're behind in points and that removing this model is the only way you can get back, even if you only have a 10% chance of killing them or being able to remove them, you take that because otherwise you just lose. In order to effectively evaluate something, you need to understand what's at risk and what your actual options are for scoring. I think the idea is just to keep cognizant of the idea of sunk cost, to make sure that you're not continually throwing resources at a plan that is now the suboptimal option.
Right. So, this would kind of go back to the value of being flexible and treating each activation, and actually really each action during an activation, from kind of like a neutral mental state, right? Just being able to kind of detach yourself from what's going on, which can be quite difficult because people get caught up in events. But just being able really to look dispassionately at the situation and ask yourself, well, am I actually really furthering my goals with what I'm going to try to do?
Yeah, it really depends on the information you have. As you're playing through, like you said, every single action, every single activation should change depending on information you have on the board state. Last episode we were talking about threat ranges and stuff like that. If the opponent moves their high mobility attacker earlier in the turn, then it's no longer something you have to consider as a threat, and you're able to simplify your options, simplify your decision trees, and like reevaluate the success of any particular action.
Right.
You want to be constantly reevaluating your situation because yeah, there's tons of times where things just go wrong, right? Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Right. So, another area of playing from behind is where you're supposed to be good at something, and maybe the other crew is better at that thing. Like, you're supposed to be a fighty crew, but the other crew is stronger than you or counters you or whatever. And so, the situation is not necessarily advantageous to you, and the way you wanted to complete the game is maybe not going to work out like you had thought at the beginning, but maybe in a material sense you're not down by a lot. Is that kind of a different situation than having tried a plan and seeing that it failed?
Yeah, I would say at that point it sounds like you're still trying to decide your course of action rather than having already committed to something. This is also where, familiarity with your crew and the opponent's crew comes into it a lot. They are better at fighting than you, then there usually is something that you can abuse or something that you should be better in. I mean, there might be some edge cases where you just picked the wrong models or the wrong crew and you're just kind of outclassed in every possible way with the strategy and scheme pool.
Right.
In which case, I'm not really sure there's any worthwhile advice to be given. At that point, it really the only thing is, you just have to outplay your opponent because you're already down in terms of like resources and actions and abilities in the game.
Yeah, or you just wait for Explorer Society to come out, and then you pick that up and get your revenge.
NDA.
Hey, Winston was revealed.
Yes, but then they went through a playtest cycle, which,
Well, who knows what he'll look like at the end, but at least his revealed form, it's definitely looking like a good revenge piece. Okay, so, and although it is by now kind of cliche on our podcast, it really does come down to this sort of mental flexibility, right? To be able to read the game state and make alterations, and a lot of that's just going to come through experience.
Yeah, there's just like way too many variables in the game to just kind of give like a generic guide being like, oh, this is how you win the game.
Right. I mean, if you could do that, then
it wouldn't be Malifaux. It wouldn't be fun.
Right. Well, also, you would probably just be the best player ever.
You'd have to hide that information away from all the up and comers.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think something that you could do if you're in the situation that may be of, I guess, general use to people, is that if you find yourself in a situation where because of the matchup you're behind, oftentimes this is going to be maybe because you aren't as familiar with the matchup, right? In order to find that element where you're stronger that you had mentioned, right? So if you brought a crew that you had built to win the fight, but you find that the opponent is better suited to this particular matchup, you should feel free to ask questions about what the opponent's crew can do, and that will probably, or at least possibly, provide a hint of something that you could do instead.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Also, in like casual games, there are times where I think it's just kind of clear that you brought the wrong crew or you don't know enough about the opponent's crew to actually be effective in the matchup. And I think in those cases, it's fine just to kind of treat it as a learning game, just test the limits and try and figure out the crew so you can be better prepared next time you face them.
Right.
Like, there have been games where I've more or less lost by turn 2 just because I didn't understand how the enemy crew worked or I forgot how certain interactions worked.
Mm-hmm.
And I just ended up taking very risky moves that I thought could put me ahead when it turns out, no, this plan never would have worked in the first place.
Right. And, I think that's also an opportunity to maybe use pieces in a different way or do actions that maybe you don't see used as often on a model.
Yeah, there's like this idea that goes around all the time, like, having your master walking and interacting basically means you're wasting activations, you're wasting your efficiency, and that's basically going to lose you the game. But, sometimes that's what you need to do. Sometimes sacrificing your master or using them as a tar pit is the correct move.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And this hadn't really occurred to me at first, but as you were speaking, it came to me that because in our meta we have a lot of newer players and a lot of players who we've mentioned this before on the podcast. They kind of play Malifaux the way you play 40k, right? They've already built their list, and that's what they've brought to the store. It might even be all that they have, so they may not even have other options, and that's just what they're going to play. And the more experienced players, it's not like we intentionally counterpick against them,
Right.
but they, just by the nature of the way they do crew selection, they can definitely find themselves in these games where they start from behind. And like you mentioned, I think in those cases, just being able to learn from the game is probably the best way to glean some value out of it. I mean, aside from the fact of having fun, which is in theory what these games are about.
I think that's definitely true, and everyone learns in different ways. Like for me, I really can't learn a crew just by reading their cards. Like it does not stick in my mind. Even if I've like read through all the cards for the crew I'm gonna play, and I'm like, okay, these are the interactions that I can do. These are the things I can abuse. When I put them on the table, like it just drops from my mind, and I just have to kind of put myself through the paces and be in those situations. And then when the turn ends and I realize, oh, I could have scored that point, or oh, I could have killed that model, is when things finally start clicking for me.
Right. Yeah, actually, for me, it's forgetting things on my models that end up being significant.
Right.
Or, maybe like kind of reflexively trying to maximize a value without maybe realizing that there are instances when it's better not to, right? Like, the game that we played where I was playing Reva and you were playing Hamlin, one of the later turns, I used the Jogger's bonus action lets him teleport and suck up burning from other models. I forget what that action is called, but I just reflexively took the maximum amount of burning that I could without remembering that my plan actually depended on another model retaining at least 1 point of burning so that I could do the same action with another jogger later to put it in a position to score a point. And I'm sure if I had explained what was going on, you would have commiserated with me graciously. But, giving up that point has really helped me remember that I need burning to use that ability in the first place. Going back to, you really want to evaluate every action dispassionately before you do it. This is an instance where I didn't, right? I mean, I had a jogger that was injured. I did this action to pull off as much healing as I could, and I lost the thread of what I wanted to do. So yeah, we can say it depends until the cows come home, but until you actually forget that it depends and just go for max value and take the loss because of it, it's hard to really learn the lesson.
Right, but for me, the quickest way to learn something is to like fail horribly at it, because then it's forever burned into your memory, right?
Right.
And then yeah, there's a lot of things that I mean, I guess for me, I just need to see it on the table. I need to see it running and working. I think I've probably lost 80 or 90% of my games against a new master, just because I might glance through the cards, but just nothing clicks until I kind of start seeing them in action on the table and seeing like the synergies.
Yeah, no, I've been in the same boat, and I think it's a pretty familiar experience to most Malifaux players, especially in 3E, where I think the relative strength of masters has kind of increased, or at least masters, because the models are less familiar to people. I know that when I play against someone and I know that they haven't seen the master that I played before, I'll give a quick rundown of their basic mechanics. I won't read the card to them because they can just open the app and read the card themselves, but I'll say, okay, well, this master wants burning on models, and if I kill you while you have burning, I can summon something, or right, I mean, I'm kind of talking about Sonya now, but just whatever it is, I'll try to give just a general sense of what my master wants to do and what my master cares about.
Right. Yeah, and I think if you know the player hasn't played against your master before, that's definitely the way you should go. But if you're on the opposite side, that's definitely a question you should feel comfortable asking. The opponent generally isn't going to just automatically assume that you know nothing and start this like 10 to 15 minute explanation just in case you don't know, right?
For sure. And especially if you're not kind of at your local weekly gaming group, right? If you're in an event or something and you may be playing someone that you've never met before, you're not going to have that familiarity between the two players.
Right, right.
So if you're the unfamiliar one, if you've never seen the master that you're playing against, definitely ask a question or two. There's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly legitimate, and I think any decent person will answer any questions like that truthfully. And honestly, there's not a whole lot of reason to be stingy with the information, because your opponent can always just open up the app and read it for themselves.
Right. Yeah, on that note, I guess we could also talk about when there are times that you're behind in the game, you've evaluated the board state, and you've just kind of come to the conclusion that you can't come back from the game. Like, at what point do you think you're comfortable, like, calling the game, scooping it, and talking it through? Or I guess, how do you work through that with your opponent usually?
I would say I have pretty different opinions depending on whether I'm ahead or behind. If I'm ahead, I don't want to bring up talking it through unless it's clearly hopeless, because I don't want to be presumptuous, and I don't want someone to feel bad for playing on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know really what would motivate them to play on. Maybe they, if the situation is pretty clear, they may accept that they're not going to win, but maybe they're having fun anyways, or maybe they're trying to glean something from it. They're going to try something different, or they're just going to try to work out how one of their schemes operates or something. And so I don't want to deprive them of that opportunity. And I would say that if someone said that they wanted to play on, that wouldn't really be a problem. If I'm behind, I'm not like gonna scoop on turn 2 because my first model died or whatever, despite the fact that I hate when my models die. It has to be pretty clear to me that I can't come back for a win or a tie before I'm willing to throw in the towel.
Right.
But I would say that that applies to, as long as my opponent seems engaged. If I'm behind and I think I have, even like, I don't know, a 10 to 20% chance for a tie, I'll keep clawing. What about you?
I would agree that it depends whether you're ahead or behind. If I'm behind, I feel like it's a lot easier to bring up that conversation and just kind of talk it through. When you're in the winning position, it can definitely come off as arrogant. And I guess I'm on the opposite, that even if I think it's completely hopeless for the opponent, I'll never bring it up first if I'm in the stronger position.
Mm-hmm.
Because I guess I don't want to be presumptuous, and I feel like it can put a certain kind of pressure on the other player, and it just kind of comes off as, this game is done, I'm no longer interested, just please release me from this. When that's not the intention. It's just I think generally it's more like you said, it's kind of trying to be, I guess, considerate of their time. And I definitely know that there's cases where someone else is kind of behind, or they've made a huge error and the game is more or less over at the bottom of turn 2, but they don't want to be the person that kind of deprives you of a game of Malifaux.
Right. You bring up a really good point, and I do think it's important, and hopefully I don't come off this way. I do think it's important if you are ahead, to not be expressing any kind of disdain or the sense that, oh well, the game is no longer worth playing. For me, part of the reason why I kind of wanted to emphasize that I only do this when I'm ahead, when it's just kind of clearly hopeless, is because I don't want someone to feel obligated to continue to play out a game that seems pointless, just because they don't want to seem like a bad sport. And part of what actually makes me think about this is, we've talked about this on the podcast, that during your first game, or one of your first games, you were playing, and it became obvious to you that you were far behind pretty early on in the game, but you didn't want to be the player who said, can we just kind of call it?
Right.
Yeah, I think ultimately a lot of this is going to come down to being able to read social cues, right? And so if you feel comfortable gauging how your opponent's going to react, maybe because you know them because you play them every week or whatever, that probably gives you more flexibility. But if you aren't familiar with your opponent and you don't have a great read on how they're going to respond, the safe option is probably just to continue playing.
Yeah. And on that note, I guess like something I really like to do, and I think we try to encourage in our meta, is after, if someone decides that they want to concede the game, then we kind of go through and talking through like their position, maybe things they could have done to improve it, or, like trying to talk through the logical conclusion of the game to try and understand like, well, where do you think you lost it, or why do you think, you're no longer able to come back into the game?
Yeah, no, definitely. And, I think this is a really useful portion of the game from a learning standpoint for both players, both whoever wins and for whoever loses, because it's an opportunity to basically to drop the veil, right? To be clear about your intentions, about what you were trying to do, and about the resources that you have available to dedicate it. And then your opponent can also, with the same level of honesty, talk about what they were trying to do. And between two of you, you should be able to get a pretty clear view of how likely it would be for either player to kind of complete their plans.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of be, well, what I try to do is kind of be as charitable to the opponent as possible to try and figure out, well, what could they have likely scored? Like, how many resources would it have taken? And, when you're a newer player to Malifaux, it's kind of very difficult, I think, to estimate exactly how much you should dedicate to scoring a strategy or scoring a scheme, or how likely you are to succeed on certain actions. I know that we were talking about that a lot of the times we'll see with newer players that they'll cheat much higher than they need to in a duel because it feels like they overestimate how much the opponent would value a piece. Like I've had some opponents that will cheat like super high cards against a trap I summoned with a Pathfinder. And it's like, okay, I'm okay with you cheating this 13. And honestly, in most situations, you could have just cheated like one above what you needed to hit, and I'm not going to waste a card from my hand to try and dodge it.
Right, right. So, here's a question for you. I don't know if this has happened to you, but it just kind of brought to mind. If a newer player isn't so good at identifying, what resources it takes to accomplish something, what would you do during the talk it out stage if you can actually see that they could change the result of the game? They can claw a tie, or they could even get a win that they didn't think was possible based on their own assessment of the position.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the point where they kind of call the game and you're talking through, I think you should definitely talk through that route and also kind of give them an idea of how to assess how likely that scenario would be, right? Because there are definitely games, even though you're very far ahead, it's like there are things you can do to get a tie. And if you kind of throw probability out the window, there's definitely ways that they could come back and just win. It's like, oh, if they go through and like I fail all my duels and you succeed in all of yours, like, of course, they can completely flip the game around. So I think you kind of need to be able to talk through like probability and chances. You can compare like cards in your hand. And what I'll do a lot is because a lot of times newer players will think that they lost the game on a certain flip or a certain action, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you actually can trace it back to decisions made like the previous turn or like 5 to 6 activations ago and be like, well, at this point you really probably should have switched gears or you needed to commit more resources to this fight to actually have a chance. Your 5 cost minion probably didn't have the greatest chance at killing my armor 2 beater by themselves, like no matter how high the cards in your hand were.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think kind of going to this topic of talk about probabilities and kind of keeping a sense of what's actually realistic. When I talk through a game, I actually like to do it in kind of a sense of ranges, right? Like, in my opinion, based on the board state and based on what we've been saying, this result is kind of the most likely result. And, at the point where we're talking it through, my expectation is that most likely result is going to be like a solid 80 to 90% likelihood. And then, the other 10 to 20%, generally there's one option that kind of dominates that remaining range. So if it was like a 90% that I win, there's like maybe a 7% they can get a tie, and then there's like this tiny 3% chance that they could actually somehow pull a win out, right? Mm-hmm. I don't generally give numbers that specific when I'm talking to someone else, just because I'm not that confident in in my percentage breakdowns or my mathematical ability.
Right.
But I do think it's kind of more helpful rather than like trying to rebut someone else's analysis or like really kind of drill down to the numbers, maybe to like just break it down into, I think this is probably what's going to happen. Maybe if some things go one way, this can happen. If it goes another way, maybe this can happen. But at the point where you're talking it through, I feel like two objective players should be able to reach pretty similar conclusions on the most likely result.
On that note, have you ever tried to talk someone out of conceding a game? Maybe they lost a model and like, now I can never win, and they concede, but like looking at the board state, you're like, well, they actually still have a pretty good chance of winning and a really good chance of tying. Do you ever be like, hey, maybe we just play like a few more activations and then see where you are? Or do you just accept the concession and then just kind of go to the post-game talk and just bring it up there?
So with one exception, which I would get to, I think I would just always accept the concession because, I don't want to talk someone into continuing a negative experience. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, the way you phrase the question, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's just I'm answering the question the way you phrased it. The way you phrase the question, in order for me to kind of know that they are actually not losing, I generally need information that maybe I don't have. Like if I don't know what their schemes are or whatever, it might be hard for me to say that. But one situation where I actually would do something like this, and where I have done something like this, is if they express an opinion which is factually wrong, right? Like, oh, well, there's no way that I can kill this guy. And it's because they have a lack of understanding about the rules of the game, right? Like about what their model does or what my model does. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, actually, I recall that I played a game with Raspy, and somebody was saying, "Oh, well, there's no way for me to remove these pillars." I mean, any model can take an action to remove them, and actually, this guy that you have has an action to just destroy all destructible terrain as a soulstone miner, and so in that case, because their belief was factually incorrect, I wouldn't say that I lobbied them to continue, but I would express that actually they had options that maybe they didn't appreciate, and then they did want to continue with the game. But I would also say that, if you talk someone into continuing and the next turn goes really badly for them, you probably would end up feeling pretty miserable as well.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't be the greatest. Like, here, just let me beat up on you for another turn.
I do think that you bring up a good point, though, because especially if you're newer to Malifaux and you feel like you're losing because you're losing the fight, it can be easy to believe that you're just losing the game. Whereas maybe as a more experienced player, you can see ways that your opponent could come back. They would just never really occur to them. Even in that case, I would question whether it would be useful to try to talk them into it, because the ways that you see for them to come back are not really viable based on where they currently are in the game.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's been a lot of times where, when I was playing earlier, I would just get stuck into a fight and be like, I have to remove this model because, I've already committed to this action, the whole sunk cost fallacy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When, in later games or like now, there would be a lot of times I'll start a fight and be like, well, this isn't going as well as I thought it would. Originally, removing this model was the best course of action, but now it's way too activation or resource intensive, and it's easier just to like sack one of my guys to just tie him up for the turn while I disengage and move in position to score something on the following turn.
That's kind of an interesting thing about Malifaux is, I mean, unless you're getting, totally boxed in or totally stomped, people usually have options, right? Like, even in a pretty bleak board state, there's usually something you can do to improve the situation. I mean, is it going to turn a loss into a win or into a tie? Maybe not. But I think it's pretty rare for a game of Malifaux to be hopeless.
Yeah, I would agree. In most cases, you do have a way of coming back. I mean, obviously, as the game progresses, your potential range of options for scoring or catching up become more and more limited.
Yeah, I mean, I recall going to an event back when events were a thing, I was soloing Colette because it's a tournament and they expect painted models, and she's the only crew I had painted. But, so I was soloing Colette, and Colette actually died on turn 2 because it was pre-nerf Lee Sin and he was broken, and I had magical training on Colette specifically for Counterspell because I figured I could at least make Lee Sin pay to make the irreducible damage trigger, and I forgot about Counterspell for whatever reason, so I didn't even make him discard cards, and if I had recalled, he wouldn't have actually been able to kill Colette on turn 2. And so, losing Colette on turn 2 is a pretty big deal for her crew because she really brings a lot of functionality. But this was a situation where I was able to kind of examine the board state and say, okay, well, this happened, but it's actually brought a lot of his crew out of position. And so I was able to, kind of score enough points on the corner to win. And, the point of the story isn't that, oh, well, I'm so great. Although if people want to take that away from it, I guess I don't really mind. But it's just more that I think these moments that seem important, like when something big happens in the game, whether it's good for you or whether it's bad for you, that should probably be a clue for you to try to reevaluate kind of the board state and what's going on in the game and what you can do going forward.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important, and it kind of comes with experience and just trying to learn, I guess, kind of the limits of your crew or help you reevaluate how important certain models are. Like with that game when you're playing Rev against Hamlin, I think I lost Nyx turn 2 and Hamlin turn 3. I remember Brian was watching, and at the end of the game, I'd managed to actually scramble back and get a win from that game. And Brian was like, well, how the hell did you win when you lost Hamlin turn 3? And I was like, well, with the board state, Hamlin wasn't really doing much for me at that point, right? So it's when I lost Hamlin, of course, I wasn't oh, this is great, everything's going according to plan. Well, if I take a step back and look at it, I'm still in a decently strong position. I still have a good chance at winning the game despite my 2 strongest models being taken out of the game fairly early on.
Yeah, no, and I mean, that's, a perfect example of the fact that, Malifaux is not about killing, right? You fell behind in the fight, but you didn't need to win the fight. Maybe you didn't even ever want to win. I mean, I'm sure you would have liked to have won the fight, but
that would have been
it may not even
yes.
be part of your plan. Yeah. But actually, that is something else. If you are losing and you think you've just lost, it can be pretty satisfying to just try to kill some models.
Oh, that revenge, the sweet revenge activation, yeah.
So, in general, I think it makes sense to talk through games, or rather, it's best to talk through games when the issue is just clearly not in doubt. But are there any instances where you would kind of consider talking through a game when it's actually still up in the air?
I mean, the biggest one I think everyone could relate to is just time.
Mm-hmm.
Recently we had to cut a game short, I think, top of turn 3, just because, we had people saying they were looking for games and they ended up coming in 2 hours late. So we're like, well, just start a game.
Right.
And in that case, you try and talk through, and I think at that point, there were just way too many unknowns for us to decide who was going to win or who was going to lose, or even if it would be a tie. There were a lot of things that, well, if it goes this way, and it's we got 3 turns left to go, it's way too hard to predict what would happen.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, and I guess in other cases, when I guess the opponent wants to concede early, again, I'm never going to talk them out of that. So even though they definitely have a lot of options for coming back, losing your big beater model or your master turn 2 can just be very demoralizing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, I would agree with that. Time is the number one thing, especially in events, right? Because it can be hard to finish a 5-turn Malifaux game within most event windows. So yeah, I mean, I think we're probably of similar minds there. So looking at maybe another situation where you're playing from behind, we talked about where the board state is available to both players, and it's clear from that public information that one player is behind and what that player might do to come back. But it's also possible for you to be behind, but the opponent not know it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one example that happened to us recently was, actually that game that we had to wrap up on turn 3, I had take prisoner on your mecha pork chop, and I accidentally killed it, right? I flipped severe, and it unexpectedly died, and then I knew that I could not score 2 points. Like, those 2 points were just
Right.
gone. So in that situation, when you have information that's telling you that you're behind, or that it's going to be an uphill battle, what would you do? And I guess the very first question is, if you were me in that situation, would you have cheated in a low card to not kill the pork chop and just totally tip your hand?
In that case, it might be. I mean, I probably wouldn't have, but I could see an argument for doing it. Because if I do know that you have take prisoner, at least you still have the option for those points on board. And either I
Mm-hmm.
guess I'll be like super aggressive with the pork chop and like run him in because I know you're not going to kill him. But in that case, you're going to get the take prisoner point. Like, it also puts your opponent in a fairly interesting position as to like how they're going to use that model. Like, are they just going to constantly babysit it, which might be the right answer, and like I guess what a lot of people would do, but it might also limit their ability to score other things, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I can say that I didn't cheat it in because, well, two reasons. One, at that point, I just felt like my best plan was to try to gain the upper hand based on the board state, and maybe make up the difference by denying you points. And then the second one was, I felt like if you knew you would be able to deny at least one of those points through play. So I felt like I was actually only really going to be playing for 1 point, after tipping my hand like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very valid. I mean, like, honestly, I'm not even sure how I'd play with that information because it like never really happens to me. Right? Usually, by the time I know what the opponent's going to score, it's usually like positional based stuff. Or, I mean, I guess like scheme based
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Like, oh, they dropped a marker in the middle. I kind of know what they're going for. But, positional stuff like take prisoner and stuff like that, I guess maybe better players always have it at top of mind. But a lot of the times, like, I don't even think about that. Oh, this model might have take prisoner on. In that game, I don't think I would have worried about Mecha Pork Chop getting tied up or be like, oh man, I got to keep all my guys real close so he can't score take prisoner.
Right, right. No, that makes sense. So I guess moving away from my specific situation, just more generally, if you find that you are behind, or at least, potentially behind, but this information is not known to your opponent, is that going to affect your play at all?
I mean, I think it definitely has an impact on me, and I think it should have an impact on everyone, right? Because ideally, every turn, you should be evaluating where you are and how you can score the points available to you. And if you no longer have like a scheme available to you, or if you know you can't score strategy for that turn, it's going to modify how you move around the board, like how much you focus on denial and how you operate in general. So if it's kind of like the last turn in the game, or I have a model that is in position to score a strategy or pick up, say, a symbol on the next turn, but I have no one close enough to pick up one this turn, then I'm going to shift most of my guys into either supporting and ensuring that I get that pickup next turn, or denying my opponent a pickup on this turn, or setting up for denial later in the game and try and keep those strategy scores as even as possible.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. I think for me, if I have information that my opponent doesn't have that tells me that I am behind, I do tend to shift to more of a denial based
Mm-hmm.
strategy, because I actually think that, and I mentioned this before on another episode, but I think Malifaux really lends itself to disruptive style play. And if your opponent is spending actions to achieve a goal, if you take some, or maybe even all, depending on the situation, of the actions that you were going to use to fulfill your own goal that turn, and put them into denial, I feel like you have a decent chance of that. And I also think that, since one of the most common forms of denial is killing or forcing models to be out of position, that method can pay dividends down the road that might give you enough value to kind of, I guess, make up the difference later.
Yeah, and if we kind of talk about the high level stuff, this kind of comes down to resource allocation, right? So ideally, when you start the game, when you hire your crew, you have certain models that you kind of have set, like these guys are going to be working on scoring the strategy, these guys are going to be working on scoring my schemes. And if on a particular turn, those models aren't able to do what they need to do, then you want to be able to put those resources to work for you in another way, whether that be denial or setting up for future turns.
Right, right. And and this is an instance where you probably want to be flexible in how you're going to use a model, right? You might have brought in a 10 stone beater to kill things, but you might just need that model to stand around the center point and deny claim jump, and instead of killing something. And if that's what it's got to do to get you where you need to go, that's what it's got to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some cases where, it can feel bad having your master, dropping that scheme marker in the corner and just removing themselves from the game entirely. But it's maintaining that kind of like neutrality and keeping in mind that the point of the game is to score as many points as possible. There will be times where it's like the correct choice to just cede, map control entirely just to secure your points. There can be times where it's better just to let the opponent run off and not even try to deny them, because you know that at the end of the game, you're able to score all 8 points. And with how they positioned or how the game has gone, they're only going to be able to get 7.
Yeah, makes sense. So I guess the kind of last subject to hit on this part of the topic about playing from behind is playing for the tie, right? So oftentimes Malifaux is kind of talked about in binary terms, like you either win or you lose. But ties are a possible result in Malifaux, and I would say that they're not necessarily unusual in any sense, right?
Right.
And I've mentioned in previous episodes of the podcast that I consume a lot of chess media. I'm not a good chess player, but I do like chess media, and a familiar refrain in chess is kind of holding the draw or playing for the draw, right? It's an objective of players, if you're behind, to kind of defend a weaker position, and kind of make a draw. So do you ever find yourself in that situation where you're looking to play for a draw instead of a win?
I would say very rarely, and I would preface this by saying that since I don't really play in tournaments and it's normally casual play, I like to be a lot more aggressive. I never like go into a turn usually thinking like, all right, I'm gonna play for the tie. I always go for like the low percentage chance of taking the win. So I'll only ever go for the tie if it's I know 100% I can't score the points to get the win, then I'll go for a tie. But there's like a 95% chance I could get the tie and like a 1% chance I could get the win. I would go for that 1% chance.
That's what makes you a top 1% player. It's because you're just able to pull out all of those 99% lost games, and when you add that to the huge proportion of games that you are already winning, you just become unstoppable. Uh, Interestingly, I don't know if maybe it is influenced by my affection for chess, but I find myself playing for the tie when I'm behind, and it's kind of like, oh well, if a win possibility emerges, I might take it, but not really at the risk of my tie. It's more like, oh well, I've improved things to where it's more or less, a tie is the most likely result, and I have a chance for a win, but taking it is not really going to imperil my tie, or not significantly imperil it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so much because I don't want to lose the game. I mean, obviously, in a sense, I don't want to lose it. But I think for me, it's more about, I feel, and I don't know why this is true, but I feel a greater sense of achievement if I salvage a lost game into a tie than if I go for kind of a moonshot and it works out.
That kind of reminds me. I remember when they were talking about I forget the exact name for it, but I think it was IBM, they created that machine to play Go, like the old style like Chinese game where you have like stones and like a 19 by 19
Yeah,
board.
I think it was called Alpha Zero.
I think it was AlphaGo. Now that you
AlphaGo,
mention
yeah.
it.
Oh, sorry, Alpha Zero is the chess machine.
Oh, okay. But yeah, the interesting thing was they're saying that when the computer is calculating win conditions, if it has like a 99% chance to win by 1 point as opposed to like a 90% chance to win by like 10 or 15 points, it'll always go, for the highest chance victory, because a victory is a victory.
Mm-hmm.
But like humans are very uncomfortable playing into that position, right?
Right.
You don't want to just squeak by with a win, even if that is the highest percent chance, because to us, there's like, if you only win by 1 point, or if this plan will only get you to like maybe a tie, it feels uncomfortable,
Uh-huh.
because you're always thinking, well, if something even slightly goes wrong, all of a sudden this is a loss.
Right. Oh, I was just gonna say, it's funny you mentioned that, because I have a experience from, I was playing another player in our meta, and he was playing Euripides, and I was playing Misaki, and I gained a commanding lead over the game early, but there was just a disastrous, I think it was turn 3 or turn 4, and just about every flip went went the wrong way, and none of my plans worked out, and my opponent made some really good adjustments, and what was just a solidly locked win, it was now I was behind, and I was in a situation where I could try for a win and have like about a maybe a 40% chance of winning and a 60% chance of losing, or I could play for a tie and I'd have like 80% chance for a tie, and then the remaining 20% were split between win or loss, just depending on how a couple flips went, and in that instance I actually I did go for the tie rather than take the 40-60 shot. And I think that probably speaks to just the kind of player I am, and that is part of what makes Malifaux interesting to me compared to other war games, because in 40k, even though it's been a long time since I played a 40k game, but when I used to play 40k regularly, I rarely felt like I won or lost the game because of a decision I made, or at least decisions other than list building. Whereas in Malifaux, pretty much every game I think comes down to a decision that either player made, or the series of decisions that the players make.
Yeah, and that's part of what the appeal to me is, like, that there's very solid takeaways from the game that you can use to improve on, or like things you can adjust, even just from like turn to turn, activation to activation, have an effect on the game. Whereas like you're saying in 40k, sometimes the start of the turn you just take a bad hit from the enemy, you like fail all your saving throws, and you're just kind of out of the game.
Right. Yeah, yeah. In some editions of 40k, I mean, the matchups are so dramatic that it's like, okay, well, we set up our armies and we're gonna roll for initiative, and whoever wins this die wins the game, right?
Yeah, I've heard about that. That just sounds like so toxic.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna sit here and we're gonna roll dice for the next 3.5 hours, but the game is over after this initiative die. And Malifaux, kind of like what you said earlier in the episode, even if there does seem like there was a big moment like that, if you look back at what brought you to that moment, you'll see that it's actually, kind of a chain of decision points. And it's very rare that just one big incident has completely characterized the game. So on that note, I guess we can turn to the last topic we want to talk about in terms of playing from behind, and that's when to scoop, right? The ultimate decision when you've decided that you're playing from behind and it's too much. The hill is too big to climb. So when would you look to scoop, Colgan, and why? What would kind of inform your decision?
I think the biggest thing is if you kind of look at what you have left to score, your ability to score, and if you are unable to, reasonably get those points, that's kind of the time to scoop. Like maybe you miss scoring strat on your first 2 turns, and your opponent has, like he's already scored 2 strat, and like he has assassinate, he's locked in assassinate, and he's gotten reveal. Like he's at 5 points, and you're kind of looking at a maximum of like maybe 6 points if everything goes great for you. And then, it's kind of like looking ahead and saying, well, what are my chances of scoring this? And I think a big thing too is just kind of your mental state at that point. There are definitely times where I think it's better sometimes just to scoop just for, your mental health. Like, okay, maybe sure, if I keep grinding this out and everything goes perfect, I have like maybe a 5% chance of like turning this around or getting that tie, but it might be better just to like close this game out early, talk it out, and then just run through another one and just kind of have like that mental refresh and kind of like reset your mental state.
Right. Yeah, and I think what really resonates with me in terms of your answer is why you're scooping, right? If you kind of realize, oh yeah, this game is completely over, and you're far enough in to make that decision, right? It's not like turn one, a flip didn't go your way and now you're salty. We've wrapped up turn three, and it's pretty hopeless. And if we scoop now, we can get in another game. To me, that's kind of the right reason to scoop, and the wrong reason is, you're just mad.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, I guess I shouldn't even say wrong, because if the experience is negative and you're angry, maybe you can avoid a nasty incident if you.
Yeah, I would actually argue, like, I think that's a perfectly good reason to scoop. If you're in a mental state and you're just like super angry and you just realize this is gonna make you angry, like, even if it's irrational, like, it's probably good to scoop.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, I would say that if that happens very easily, maybe Malifaux and war games in general might not be for you.
Oh yeah. I mean, if that's the case, you might want to reevaluate some other things. And like, I mean, this is going to go way deeper and like into areas we're definitely not qualified to advise on.
But I do think one area where scooping can be helpful is if the matchup is unfamiliar and you've just been totally caught out, not because your opponent did anything nefarious in terms of withholding information or whatever, but just you didn't know the matchup because of the early maybe develop, or maybe a deployment, early actions, or just the way you kind of didn't understand how things go, and you get sort of wiped off the board late turn 2, early turn 3. That's the kind of reset that I think could have a lot of value. Just to say, okay, I've lost, this game is a loss. Can we start over? And now that I know these things, I'll get to try out a response to it. And that's a way to turn kind of a negative into a positive.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think the most important thing is like just evaluating the game state and honestly evaluating your own mental state at that point, right? If at this point it feels like you don't want to grind it out, if you're just not feeling it, I think that's a perfectly fine reason to concede. I think overall the most important thing is you want to make sure that it's a positive play experience for everyone playing the game, right? Because at the end of the day, especially in casual play, that's all that really matters.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're definitely on board there. And, I mean, not to, pat ourselves on the back, but it's almost unheard of for our games to end in, like somebody doing the rage quit, right?
Right.
And there have been instances where games have been quite lopsided and the players have, called that game and reset. And maybe not even the result was necessarily different in terms of who won and who lost the next game, but the experience was quite different. And so to me, that's an indication that the players made an accurate read of the situation and then, were able to make a positive experience from that. Well, if you sat through another hour of It Depends being restated 99 different ways, we appreciate it. We here in Los Angeles play in just one small corner, but we are interested in being part of the wider Malifaux discussion, and that is one reason why we're doing this podcast. So if you've listened and you would like to let us know how we're doing, send us an email or leave a comment. Any feedback would be appreciated. We would just love to hear from you guys. And if you'd like to support the channel with a like or a share or a subscribe, that would be super cool. And we also have links to PayPal and Patreon in our show notes. And so we are always open to help. Otherwise, that's going to do it for us tonight. And so thank you for listening.
Thanks, guys.